The golden light of the setting sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows over the quiet outskirts of the city. Officer Emily Carter was making her way back to her patrol car after a long shift. The crisp autumn air carrying the distant sounds of the city behind her. She had always trusted her instincts. And when a sudden rustling came from the underbrush, she stopped immediately. Her hand hovered near her holster as she scanned the area. Then, from between the trees, a small striped figure emerged. A tiger cub. It stood motionless for a moment, its amber eyes locked onto hers, not with fear, but with urgency. Then, without hesitation, it turned, took a few steps forward, and looked back, as if it wanted her to follow. Something about the moment sent a chill down her spine. Tigers didn't belong here, and if this one was alone, something was very, very wrong. With her heart pounding, Emily took a breath, then stepped forward, following the cub into the unknown. Where are you watching this from? Leave a comment below. Don't forget to like and subscribe before continuing with this exciting story. Officer Emily Carter had spent the last 6 years patrolling the city, handling all sorts of cases, from minor disputes to dangerous criminal chases. She prided herself on her instincts, always trusting her gut when something didn't feel right. But on this particular evening, as she walked toward her car after a long shift, she had no idea that her instincts would lead her somewhere completely unexpected. It was late afternoon, and the sky was painted in hues of orange and pink. She had decided to take a shortcut through the quieter outskirts of the city, an area where the urban landscape blended into untamed patches of woodland. The air smelled of damp earth and fallen leaves, and the soft crunch of her boots against the ground was the only sound she could hear. Then, a rustling noise came from the nearby bushes. Emily froze. Her hand instinctively moved to the holster on her hip. But she didn't draw her weapon just yet. She had encountered stray animals before: dogs, raccoons, even the occasional deer that had wandered too far from the forest. But as she turned her gaze toward the undergrowth, what stepped out made her heart stop. A tiger cub. It was no bigger than a medium-sized dog. Its fur golden orange with deep black stripes. Its ears were perked up, and its large amber eyes locked onto hers. But it wasn't growling or acting aggressively. Instead, it seemed desperate. Emily stayed still, assessing the situation. There was no way a tiger cub should be here. Tigers weren't native to this region. It had to be an escaped exotic pet or, more likely, a victim of illegal wildlife trafficking. The cub took a tentative step forward, then another, before stopping to look back at her as if it was waiting for her to follow. "What is it, little one?" she murmured. The cub turned and took a few more steps away, stopping again to glance at her. It was clear now, it wasn't running away. It wanted her to come. Emily hesitated for only a moment before following. The cub led her away from the road and into the trees. The further they walked, the more uneasy Emily became. She knew this area was mostly uninhabited, except for a few abandoned buildings and stretches of undeveloped land. If someone had dumped the cub here, they had likely done so for a reason. Still, she trusted her gut, and right now, her gut told her that this cub was trying to show her something important. The walk was longer than she expected. The cub moved with surprising agility, darting over roots and under low-hanging branches, stopping occasionally to make sure she was still behind it. Emily had never seen an animal act this way. Most strays would either flee or cower in fear. But this little tiger had a purpose. Finally, after nearly 10 minutes of trekking, they reached a small clearing in the woods. Emily's breath caught in her throat. In the middle of the clearing was a crude metal cage. The structure was rusted and poorly made, but it was secure enough to keep an animal trapped inside. And inside, barely moving, was an adult tiger. Emily's heart pounded. The larger tiger's body was thin, its breathing slow and labored. The chains wrapped around the cage suggested it had been here for a while, possibly days. The cub let out a soft cry and padded toward the cage, pressing its tiny paws against the bars. The adult tiger stirred slightly, opening one weary eye before closing it again. Emily felt a surge of anger rise in her chest. She had dealt with cruelty before, cases of neglect, abuse, and violence. But this was beyond cruel. Someone had left this tiger to die here, locked up and forgotten. Her fingers curled into fists as she pulled out her phone and quickly dialed her station. "This is Officer Carter," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through her veins. I need an animal rescue unit immediately. Possible illegal poaching activity. I'm deep in the wooded area near the city's outskirts. Send backup now. She ended the call and took a deep breath, trying to figure out what to do next. The cub was still by the cage, nudging at the bars with its nose. It let out another small cry, as if pleading for Emily to do something. She crouched down beside it and gently ran a hand over its head. You did the right thing bringing me here, she whispered. I won't let anything happen to either of you. The cub let out a soft purr in response. Emily examined the cage more closely. The chains were thick, but they weren't padlocked. Whoever had done this likely intended to return at some point, possibly to transport the tiger elsewhere. But they hadn't counted on someone finding it first. She reached for her utility knife and began working at the rusted chains, her muscles tensing with effort. It wasn't easy, but after several minutes of prying, one of the chains snapped loose. The cage door shifted slightly, but she needed more force to get it open. Just as she was about to try again, she heard a distant rustling. She stiffened. The cub did too. Its ears perked up, and its body went rigid. Emily turned her head slowly toward the direction of the noise. Someone was coming. Her training kicked in immediately. She stood up, one hand resting on her gun, the other steadying the cub, keeping it close to her. Whoever had done this might be returning, and they wouldn't be happy to find a police officer here. She took a deep breath and prepared for whatever was about to happen next. The tiger cub stayed by her side, its tiny body trembling, but not with fear. Emily stood alert, her heart pounding as she listened. The rustling in the bushes was sudden and sharp, breaking through the quiet tension of the forest. She instinctively reached for her holster, scanning the darkened undergrowth. The little tiger cub beside her tensed up, its tiny body pressed close to her leg. Her radio had crackled just moments ago. Backup was on the way. But it would take at least 20 minutes for the nearest wildlife rescue team to reach this remote location. Until then, she was alone with the two tigers, one barely clinging to life inside the rusty cage, and the other, the brave little cub who had led her here. But now, something, or someone, was still hiding in the bushes. Emily took a slow step forward, her senses on high alert. Who's there? She called out, her voice firm but calm. The cub let out a soft sound, almost like a chirp, and glanced toward the bushes. The rustling stopped. Then, a small shape emerged from the shadows. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she saw what it was. Another tiger cub, smaller than the first, its fur slightly darker, its big amber eyes filled with hesitation. And then another one. Two more cubs. They were huddled close together, their tiny bodies pressed into the undergrowth as if they had been hiding for a long time. Their ears were pinned back, their tails curled around themselves. Unlike the first cub, these two seemed much more frightened. Oh my God, Emily whispered. The first cub, the one that had led her here, let out a small chuffing sound and took a few steps toward them. It was clear now, these weren't just any tigers. They were siblings. Emily's heart twisted. The cubs must have been hiding here all along, too scared to come out when she first arrived. Maybe they had watched their mother get trapped. Maybe they had spent days waiting, unsure of what to do. But this little one, the one who had been brave enough to follow her, had decided to act. Emily knelt down slowly, keeping her movements calm. It's okay, she said softly. I'm not here to hurt you. The cubs remained frozen in place, their wide eyes locked on her. She knew that if she moved too quickly, they might run, and in their tiny, malnourished state, they might not make it far. The first cub turned and let out another small noise, stepping even closer to its siblings. It nudged the nearest one gently with its head, as if trying to coax them forward. Emily watched in awe. This little cub wasn't just looking for help, it was looking out for its family. Slowly, ever so slowly, one of the hiding cubs took a hesitant step forward. Emily stayed perfectly still, her breath steady, waiting. Then, the second cub followed. Finally, the three siblings were together again. The first cub let out a tiny huff, brushing its head against the other two in reassurance. Emily swallowed hard, a lump forming in her throat. This wasn't just about saving one animal anymore. These cubs had lost everything. Their mother was barely alive inside that cage. They had been left alone, scared, starving, and yet, they had held on. She had to protect them. Her fingers tightened around her radio, Dispatch. This is Officer Carter, she said, her voice urgent but steady. I've just found 2 additional tiger cubs. 3 in total. They're scared but unharmed. The mother is still in critical condition. I need that rescue team here ASAP. The radio crackled in response. Copy that, officer. Rescue team is 15 minutes out. 15 minutes. She could wait. She had to wait. Emily kept her eyes on the cubs. Her heart breaking at how small they were. She had no idea who had done this to them. Who had stolen their mother. Trapped her. And left them alone to fend for themselves. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just an accident. Someone had meant for this to happen. And Emily was going to make sure they paid for it. For now, though, all she could do was stay here. Stay with them. And let them know they were safe. Emily had never felt such relief as she did when she finally saw the flashing lights of the rescue team approaching through the trees. The distant hum of their vehicles cutting through the silence of the forest was like a promise. Help was here. She had spent the last 15 minutes kneeling near the 3 tiger cubs, keeping them as calm as possible. The first cub, the brave one who had led her here, had stayed closest to her, watching her with unwavering trust. The other 2 had gradually relaxed, their small bodies pressing together for comfort. Inside the cage, their mother still lay weak and unmoving, but Emily could see the faint rise and fall of her chest. She was hanging on. When the rescue team arrived, they wasted no time. A group of wildlife veterinarians and conservationists rushed to the scene, their faces etched with concern. They carefully approached the mother tiger first, assessing her condition before administering a sedative that would allow them to transport her safely. She's severely dehydrated, one of the vets muttered, checking the tiger's pulse, but she's alive. We can save her. Emily exhaled the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The cubs, however, were a different story. The moment the rescue team tried to reach for them, they recoiled, pressing themselves into the undergrowth. The smaller 2 let out frightened little growls, while the first cub turned toward Emily, looking to her as if for reassurance. Emily swallowed hard. She had been trained to handle high-pressure situations, to de-escalate conflicts, to negotiate with people on the verge of violence. But this, gaining the trust of 3 orphaned tiger cubs? That was something entirely different. Still, she had to try. She knelt down, her voice soft and steady. It's okay, she murmured. They're here to help. The first cub hesitated, glancing between her and the rescuers. Then, as if making a decision, it took a small step forward. Emily extended her hand. The cub nudged her fingers with its tiny nose before turning back to its siblings, letting out a small chuffing sound. Whatever it was trying to communicate, it seemed to work. Slowly, the other 2 cubs followed. The rescuers moved in carefully, wrapping the cubs in soft blankets and placing them in secure carriers. The mother was lifted onto a stretcher, her massive body carefully handled by the team. Emily watched as they loaded the animals into the transport truck, feeling a strange mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and something else she couldn't quite name. She had done her part. But this wasn't the end of their journey. Weeks passed, and life moved on, but Emily couldn't stop thinking about them. The cubs, their mother, the way the first little tiger had trusted her so completely. She had kept in touch with the rescue team, receiving regular updates on their recovery. The mother tiger, now named Maya, had regained her strength thanks to careful treatment at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, a sanctuary dedicated to caring for rescued exotic animals. The cubs, too, were thriving, eating well, growing stronger, and even beginning to play like normal young tigers should. But the one thing that stuck with Emily the most? The first cub still looked for her. They've all adjusted well, one of the conservationists had told her over the phone. But the eldest cub, he's different. He still looks toward the gates every time we have visitors. Almost like he's waiting for someone. Emily knew she had to go see them. When she finally arrived at the sanctuary, she felt a rush of nerves. Would they still recognize her? Or had they already moved on, adapting to their new environment? The staff led her to the cubs' enclosure, a spacious, naturalistic habitat with plenty of trees, grass, and places to hide. And then she saw them. The 3 cubs were lounging under a tree, their coats now sleek and healthy, their bodies bigger than she remembered. The moment she stepped closer, the first cub, her cub, lifted its head. Their eyes met. For a brief moment, nothing happened. Then, with a chuffing sound of recognition, The cub bolted forward, closing the distance between them in an instant. Emily crouched just as the tiger reached the fence, pressing its head against the barrier between them. She reached out, touching the warm fur through the gaps, her throat tightening. "You remember me, don't you?" she whispered. The cub let out a soft sound, rubbing its head against the fence in a gesture of familiarity. Emily let out a shaky breath. She had never expected to form this kind of bond. But here it was, undeniable, unbreakable. The other two cubs soon followed, less hesitant than before, nudging against their sibling as they stared up at her with curious, familiar eyes. Emily spent the next hour with them, watching them play, seeing the way they had grown into their own personalities. It was a moment she knew she would never forget. What Emily didn't realize was that her story, the story of a police officer who had followed a tiger cub into the forest and uncovered an illegal poaching operation, had spread far beyond her city. News outlets picked up the incredible rescue, highlighting not just Emily's bravery but also the heartbreaking reality of illegal wildlife trafficking. People across the country were moved. Donations flooded into wildlife conservation organizations. Awareness campaigns about endangered species gained traction. Lawmakers even began discussing stricter penalties for poachers, citing Emily's case as an example of why better protections were needed. She had never expected any of this. She had just followed a gut feeling. And yet, because of that choice, because she had trusted one small, brave tiger cub, she had helped spark something much bigger than herself. As she stood at the sanctuary, watching the cubs roll and play under the warm afternoon sun, she knew one thing for certain: this was only the beginning. For them, for her, and for every wild animal that deserved a chance to be free.
What do you think about today's story? Do you believe situations like this can happen in real life? If you have any thoughts or feedback, feel free to leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any exciting stories. See you in the next video.